Welcome to the International House of Japan's webinar series, Leaders Shaping the Future of the Indo-Pacific. I am Masako Ishii of Rikyo University, and I have been studying about the peace process between the Philippine government and the Moro separatist groups. In this session, we are grateful to invite Ms. Miriam Coronel Ferrer, or Miriam-san, who is a prominent Filipino activist and peace advocate. She is best known for her role in the peace negotiations between the Philippine government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or MILF, the largest armed group in the Philippines, aiming at resolving the long-standing conflict in the region.
Thank you, Professor Ishii, for the very warm welcome. And hello to our listeners today. So you made a very good overview of our process. It was a very long process that took 17 years, way before I joined the government panel. But in the end, we were able to sign the comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front in 2014. Women's inclusion has been a very important feature of our process. And I think that's why it is on that count that our negotiations had garnered significant attention. I think we know that very few negotiations actually involve women at the top level, meaning doing the actual negotiations and many of the decisions and strategies that are very necessary to succeed in a very contentious and delicate process. So if we look at our experience on this count, the government team has always had many women, including the heads of our secretariat, the head of our secretariat, our lawyers, and many young program officers who joined and assisted us, as well as fellow panel members. And it's their very presence, the very presence of a lot of women inside the negotiating room, precisely changed the dynamics and created a different kind of a picture. If you look at many of the pictures of signing ceremonies, this will be mostly all men on the stage or sitting around the table. But ours has become unique precisely because of the leading roles that have been played by women. Now, it was not easy to actually convince the other party, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, to actually bring in women in their team. In the beginning, there was resistance. They said our panel, made up of 5 to 6 people, they said is already representative of the different ethnic groups that make up the Bangsamoro community. But then they were all men, and it will be very delicate to remove any member of the panel to be able to bring in a woman. So the opportunity came for women to join the delegation of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front when we opened up the room to consultants and members of the technical working groups that work on the different annexes that now make up our peace agreement. And we got a lot of support from the international and domestic community to really push that kind of women's presence on the part of the delegation of the MLF. So in that sense, it sort of like became a normal thing that you actually have men and women working together and struggling together, even fighting each other in words, of course. But in any case, it was a very dynamic process and also very inclusive in that sense. Now, it's not just about participation. When we talk about women's inclusion, certainly it's not just about participation. What's actually even more important are the outcomes. the kinds of provisions that are provided for in the agreement, and therefore what will need to be implemented now that the agreement has been signed. So in the beginning, again, it was a little difficult to include some very basic women's or gender-related provision. For example, in the beginning, we wanted the reiteration of rights of women among the rights that shall be protected in a new political entity. We specified in particular the meaningful political participation of women and freedom from all forms of violence. It was not because our counterparts were against women's rights, but they wanted to be clear about what exactly was meaningful. What did we mean when we said meaningful political participation? The stress on the political, of course, it has to do with the fact that very few women are present in public life. Even more so in their communities. But women are actually very involved now in socioeconomic endeavors, etc., even becoming migrant workers. But in public life, there's very, very little still participation of women. And that's why we wanted to emphasize political. But it was really the word meaningful that was sort of problematic, because by meaningful, what you actually meant was not something that's token, something that's not just like, filling in, checking the box or ticking the box that, oh, you have a woman, then it's fine. But what meaningful means is precisely one where women are actively participating in the decision making and really seeing that they're seeing and feeling that what they're contributing is also appreciated by the other side. So that was in the beginning. When we surpassed sort of the initial stages of bringing in the gender provisions, later on, it became much easier. So for example, in our annex on wealth sharing and revenue generation, we have an explicit provision for a gender and development program that should be part of both the budget planning as well as the development planning of the new political entity, which we now call the Bangsamoro Autonomous Government. So this is just some of the stories that I'd like to share. I'm very happy to note that after we signed the agreement in 2014, of course, there were a lot of trials, a lot of delays. But if you look at the arrangement now in the transitory government, you will find that a lot of women, young, very accomplished, very capable, moral women, are very much in the leadership of the transition government, heading ministries or being program officers in bureaus and so on. And I think they are really, really making a difference and showing that partnership between men and women, that both men and women have capabilities that must be tapped and must be given opportunity. All of these are now being seen in the whole process of implementing the peace agreement. Though this is not to say that women already are a majority or even very close to a 50-50 type of participation, but I think this is a process that we know will take time, but the impact is very clear, and the leap in the amount of women's participation in transforming the state and society of the Bangsamoro has been very, very crucial. So I think I will end there and welcome our any questions and comments that you might have, Professor Ishii.
Okay. Thank you very much for sharing with us your distinguished experiences in engaging negotiation, not only with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, but also to open up a space for women in the whole process. You mentioned that initially, before you open up the peace negotiation panels to bring in various concerned people, more or less the peace panels and organizations under peace panel were more or less male dominated. In those situations, have you experienced any difficulties in negotiating as a chief peace panel chair?
Yes, well, of course, all of this now is past, right? But in the beginning, there was resistance for a woman to come in as the chair. This is going to be the first time the woman will chair the government negotiating panel. We've always had women in our team. Government has always had women in their team, but not the chair. So they were afraid that having a woman as the chief negotiator on the other side would sort of tie their hands. Um, but at the end of the day, this was something that they accepted and they got used to it. So I said initially there was resistance, but there were some things that, of course, had to be part of the dynamics. For example, there was hesitation to look at another woman straight in the eyes, even though you are talking to each other, right? And this is cultural, or on the belief that part of respecting the woman is to avoid looking at her directly. And that can be a little, how to say, unsettling if on the other side, that kind of being able to talk directly and squarely with each other probably creates some discomfort as well on their other side. But these are little things that eventually were all overcome: the shaking of hands, and also being able to really trust also trust be able to establish trust even with the few women, one or two women that they brought in their teams, because they are so good. Eventually, they were entrusted with a lot of the responsibilities, even though they never formally headed any of the technical working groups that were created. In contrast, 3 of our 4 technical working groups were headed by women. But in any case, on their end, they brought in really very capable women on whom they vested their trust a lot increasingly. And these women are now very much part of the transition government. One is a minister, the other one is also doing some work at the bureau level for the Department of Transportation and so on, or the Ministry of Transportation in the Parliament of the Bangsamoro.
Being the first chief negotiator of the peace panel, you may also had a kind of nervous feeling in the beginning, but were there any specific occasion which helped you smoothly enter and play a role as chair?
Because I was already a member of the panel 2 years, for 2 years, even though I was not the chair, I was like the senior member with another woman. Then transitioning, of course, had to do with being able to carry forward some of the things that have already been discussed. By that time, we have signed the framework agreement. And now we were going into a lot of details on the power sharing, wealth sharing arrangements, and transitional modalities, the whole set of agenda that we've called normalization, which covers security components, the commissioning of weapons and combatants, as well as transitional justice. That's a whole lot of agenda. And I think the most important aspect of all of this is that, one, they knew I was capable, that I understood the issues. I actually knew them before I became the government negotiator in probably more friendlier circumstances than when we are at the heat of the negotiations on the substantive issues. But and also to be assured that that the government is in a single line of march on all of this, because it's very important for them to continue to trust the government, to believe that the president, the late president Simeon Benigno Aquino III, who really understood the needs of this process and who really wanted this to happen, they wanted to be assured that that was the case. And for them, I was the bridge. I was the bridge to the top leadership of the country, and at that time, the trust was still being built slowly and slowly. And I think because we were able to do that, we were able to overcome the many difficulties in the negotiations.
I see. I also agree that you had a very good ceasefire mechanism composed of the CCCH and AFJAC.
True.
Yes, and so now I understand that the ceasefire on the ground had really helped you doing the engaging in the negotiations on a political level. But then, how then do you think you could overcome the Mama Sapano incident that had a huge damage, sort of incurred on the peace process?
So the Mama Sapano, which refers to a place in Maguindanao, was a tragic incident where special action forces of the police operated against an international member of the Jamaah Islamiyah, affiliated also with, who wanted to be affiliated with groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS as well. And what happened, unfortunately, was that the police leadership that was in charge of the operation did not observe the ceasefire protocols, so that when they entered the area, everybody who had weapons, 44 heavily armed police officers entering a very remote community in the marshlands of Maguindanao, creates that kind of, it resuscitates all the centuries of conflict in the minds of the people. And they all went out and battled against the police, decimating the whole group as well. And that created a serious backlash, because more Islamic Liberation Front forces were also among the armed groups that joined this the misencounter, what we call the misencounter. And so people were asking us, we already have a peace agreement, but why are they attacking our police force? It was a very legitimate question. And we say, of course, we know that civilians were also killed. Soldiers from the armed groups were also, members of the armed groups were also killed. But to really create so much, damage on the police was very hard politically in the minds of the public that continued to have this skepticism about can we trust rebel group, can we trust Muslims to be able to really seek the path of peace. This is like almost a universal bias against, unfortunately, against Islam and its followers. So we, of course, had to do a lot of explaining. Unfortunately, Senate hearings, congressional hearings on the law that we needed to draft became investigations on the incident, very acrimonious, highly televised, and so on. So much so that it took another 2 years, actually 4 years in all, under the next president before the law was passed. But what's very good about this is that nobody went back to war. The MLF stayed the course. Government also, from one president to another. There are now 2 presidents after we signed the agreement. They have also continued to implement the peace agreement, and no one party has decided to just say we're done, we're back to war.
Now, going back to our topics on pushing the gender agenda in the peace accord, you've mentioned that you had agreed in stressing the meaningful political participation of the women in the peace accord. May I know how did it happen in more detail in your peace talk? How could you agree to have to agree on that point?
On that provision.
Yes, right of women to meaningful political participations. Yes.
And freedom from all forms of violence.
Yeah.
So this is very funny in the negotiating table because we were sort of like discussing what we understood by meaningful, because the MILF chair wanted to know what we meant by meaningful. I think they wanted to be sure as to what commitments they are making. So, what the Malaysian facilitator at the time, the late Tengku Ghaffar, did was to ask the members of the English-speaking members of the international contact group. So Japan was sitting there, but those who were asked were from UK, Australia, who represented Conciliation Resources, and HD, who was an American still at the time, and they wanted to know what define meaningful for us, something like that. And somebody said genuine, or somebody said precisely inclusion, but that was questioned because inclusion without quality participation was not meaningful enough. On my end, I said the easiest way to understand the word meaningful is to look at its opposite, which is meaningless. So if for the women who are concerned, find that their participation is meaningless, then it is not meaningful. So that's how far we're going. And we also went back to one of their favorite concepts, which they learned from the Northern Ireland process, the concept of parity of esteem.
Mm-hmm.
So in Northern Ireland, what the Catholic community wanted was parity of esteem between between them and the Protestant community. And the MILF adopted this concept of parity of esteem between the Filipino majority and the Muslim Bangsamoro minority. But we told them, if you look at parity of esteem with the gender lens between men and women, this is also very important. So it is that parity of esteem between men and women that we also wanted to stress precisely by using the word meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
In the end, they went along with the word meaningful. And that's why you find it in our agreement, in the framework agreement, which is now part of the comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro. So that's how the process of negotiation actually happens over a single word.
I see. But it's interesting that you mentioned that you apply the parity of esteems to also the gender context in your peace process.
It's language that they understood. In negotiation, most of the time you have to use language that was acceptable, but also basically understood and um, meaningful in that sense to the other side. And that's why in the negotiations, we were writing text after text, sentence after sentence, and we needed to find the right words. This was not a negotiation where a third party wrote the draft for us and we worked on it. No, we were building our own text using proposals that we were exchanging with each other. So, and to really come up with a shared text, that meant a lot of negotiations and playing around with or looking for the right words to express what we mean, and for the other side for both sides to feel comfortable about it.
I see. In 2012, April 24, you had successfully include the right of women to meaningful political participation and protection from all forms of violence among the 10 decision points, which set the agenda of the peace negotiations. And you mentioned that initially when you try to come to terms with or come to agree to include this provision as one of the 10 decision points, you had lots of negotiations and discussions. But then after you agreed to include this provision, you could successfully include its provision into the framework agreement on the Bansamoro, which set the roadmap of the peace process, and as well as it is also included in the Bansamoro organic law, which was adopted in the 2000. So ratified in 2019.
Ratified in 2019.
Yeah.
So yes, eventually we added more and more gender provisions. Not a lot, I would say, and that's why we for the women's groups who gave us position papers, because we were also engaging our civil society organizations, a lot of them led by women, and also like the Women's Network at that time for 1325, the We Act 1325, we told them that some of these provisions we can no longer put in the agreement, but they can still be put in the law. That's what exactly happened. The law has far more provisions on gender responsive provisions than what you will find in the agreement. So this tells us that every step of the way, there are spaces where we can intervene and create a better arrangement. So now, in fact, the Bangsamoro Transition Parliament passed its electoral code, and it's very progressive. In the electoral code, you will have a quota system for women, 30% for the proportional, for those seats that are going to be for the regional parties that will be competing in the elections. They will need to abide by this 30% quota. Although, of course, we still need to see exactly how that will be operationalized, because it may still end up with very few women. And I asked some of the members of parliament, was it easy to convince the MLF to put in this quota of 30%? And they said, no, the chair Ibrahim Murad just asked, because 10% is too low. I think they started with 10%, and some of the women parliamentarians said this is too low. And he just asked, so what's good quota? Well, the sort of the standard international quota now is still also debatable, but still sort of like the standard quota is 30%, minimum 30%. And he readily agreed. So you can see sort of like that kind of a shift. But it's not thorough yet. It's not complete, this kind of openness. But certainly it's something that that has been opened up, and it's not going to, I mean, there will be a lot of women in their own communities who will not allow it to close again, that space, but only to push forward to make the space bigger, larger. Yeah.
I see. Yes, I also observed that there are lots of good shift happening for the women to meaningfully participate in the political process. But there still seems to be a very stereotyped image in general that Muslim women are under the strict norms set by their Islamic teachings, and their freedom is restricted. But as you have rightfully mentioned, I've also come across a very vocal, moral women who are both active in the civil societies as well as in a traditional parliament. And in your case, you've been you went many times in the southern Philippines and met directly with a Muslim woman. So how did you observe that image about the Muslim woman or Bangsamoro woman in the Philippines? And what do you think is important for them to play a role in building peace in their society?
I think for them, it's very important to see other women who are precisely doing well in the public sphere. So, for example, when I would in our many consultations on the ground, many women will come up to me and tell me, "Oh, you are, thank you. Even if you're a woman, you're able to do this." And in that sense, they're inspired that it can be done, that women can actually do these things and do a good job. But we need many of those examples, and I think there are many examples from within their own communities now. But there's still a lot of discourse that will have to be done among themselves. For example, when we pass a national law banning child marriage, it contradicts the Islamic law, which we also adopted as a national law on family, which allows marriage for women as early as 14 years old. And that created some opposition. The new national law, which banned child marriage, created opposition from among women themselves within the Islamic community. Although some women actually stood up and said, no, this is good. Islam, this is consistent with Islam, trying to distinguish between the religious teaching and the cultural practice and so on at the time. So there's that kind of debate that will still happen, or discourse that will still happen among themselves, to be able to address some of these structural issues that govern their social life, like laws on inheritance. For example, under Islamic law, children, daughters get less share in the inheritance compared to the men or their brothers. And of course, there's this whole issue about polygamy and how it disadvantages women, and some of the procedures that pertain to that. Now, these are really, really very much part of their Islamic belief. And in that sense, that kind of discussion would still have to be done among themselves for them to really be able to come up with progressive interpretations and applications of Islam. On other counts, like for example, our agreement and the law actually acknowledges acknowledges a multiple justice system: Sharia law among Muslims. Then there's the tribal justice system among indigenous communities, especially those who are not Islamic, and then of course the national justice system through our courts. But for us, it was very important to precisely allow for the development of Sharia courts to have jurisdiction of an expanded, coverage, including some aspects of criminal law. And some people feared that it's going to create conservatism, that it will bring back, inhumane punishment, which we said was not possible under our constitution, and so on. But part of the violence that continues to happen in Islamic communities is precisely the weakness of the justice system. It is in that sense, Sharia courts can help provide like a system of justice that is peaceful, does not involve killings, and just and accessible to most of the people, including family law issues, which are very, very important for women, certainly. So this all comes together as a set of packages that will benefit both men and women eventually, and create for a more just and peaceful society. Inshallah, of course. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So lastly, Can you tell us about the Southeast Asian Women Peace Mediators? In 2020, you co-founded these organizations. And so may we know why did you establish this organization and what do you do?
Okay, so we were a small group of 8 women with experience in mediation, peace building, and so on, but basically focusing on the mediation aspects. Our creation was facilitated by the Indonesian Foreign Minister Ibu Retno, who wanted to, sort of like bring in more women at the political level. And but it didn't mean that she had, and we were autonomous group, but Indonesian Foreign Ministry just facilitated our formation. And since then we spun off to be able to do so many different kinds of interventions in conflict affected countries like Afghanistan, as well as Myanmar. Of course, we know in the region Myanmar is the counterpart of Ukraine and Gaza in our region, although it's probably getting much less attention. But it's the humanitarian situation there is very, very bad. So we try to facilitate processes, very low key, under the radar activities, supporting people who are trying to find peaceful ways out of their conflict. And it's not your typical NGO or anything like that, because we know that the field of mediation it really has very different kinds of dynamics. But what we're trying to show is that it's not just about, it's not just about women doing more of these things, but it's about women who are actually showing that we can do we can make our mark in the field of mediation, and not only about women's issues, but certainly about all the difficult issues that underlie many of these conflicts. Because sometimes when you talk about women, you sort of like you're just expected to talk about women's issues. When you talk about armed conflict, there's a gender dimension to all of this, but it's hard stuff which some people continue to think can only be handled by men. So that's a point that we're trying to make, but it's not really just a point. It's about really solving the conflicts. So we don't want more trainings for women. We don't want, just talking about 1325. What we want is real action that leads to concrete solutions on the many armed conflicts in our little way, contribute to that process in a little way through some kind of facilitation.